This is the CBS radio network with a special news report. There is mass panic on the streets of America tonight as people are convinced that the Martians really have invaded. Dozens have been hospitalized and cars are blocking freeways across the nation as thousands flee, all because of a special adaptation of the War of the Worlds, a classic case of mass hysteria. Except that's not really true. This is one of the most successful examples of manufactured outrage. So, how did this story of mass panic start? And what does it tell us about how we trust media? Before we get right into it, we first need to understand what inspired Orson Welles to do something like this. Because it wasn't the first time that people were convinced that a fictional work was a real news report. In 1926, the BBC played Broadcasting the Barricades, written and presented by Catholic priest Ronald Knox, which described the storming of government by an unemployed mob who lynched politicians. The combination of simulated news reports, battle sounds, and music made it a realistic account of civil unrest. This is said to have inspired a minor panic, made worse by a lack of information due to slow newspaper delivery, but claims of extensive mass hysteria are quite exaggerated. Interestingly, this was somewhat prescient. Just a few months later, in May 1926, the general strike began, one of the largest industrial actions in British history, although there was no lynching of government ministers. Welles himself attributed this as inspiration for his radio play, and so it's no surprise that the two are quite similar. They both feature realistic battle sounds, a serious journalistic tone, and music as distraction from the real events. If you haven't already, I'd highly recommend listening to the original broadcast. Not only is it a great piece of audio drama, but it's going to make what I'm about to say a lot clearer. Let's crack this case wide open. The programme was listed in radio schedules as The War of the Worlds and featured in the New York Times' Events of the Week, so it's not as though it was some secret surprise broadcast. It was very clearly advertised in the days leading up. Anyone who was confused could pick up their radio schedule and see what it was. But maybe you didn't have a radio schedule, you just turned on your radio. In that case, the programme was introduced as this.
Columbia Broadcasting System and its affiliated stations present Orson Welles and the Mercury Theatre on the air in The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells.
So it's made explicitly clear at the start that this is a work of fiction, and this disclaimer would be repeated 3 more times throughout the hour-long programme. A common explanation for the hysteria is that people tuned into the programme halfway through, thereby missing the opening disclaimer and believing it to be real. In fairness, the second of these disclaimers came 40 minutes into the programme, so it is possible for people to have missed the beginning, listen for a bit, believe that it's real, then turn off again before the second disclaimer. Those who made it to the end were greeted with a debrief.
This is Orson Welles, ladies and gentlemen, out of character, to assure you that the War of the Worlds has no further significance than as the holiday offering it was intended to be. The Mercury Theatre's own radio version of dressing up in a sheet and jumping out of a bush and saying boo.
Obviously, some people did believe it was real, and we'll get onto that later. But CBS Radio issued 3 further disclaimers after the programme, at 10:30, 11:30 and midnight. For the listeners who tuned into Orson Welles' Mercury Theatre on the air broadcast from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight and did not realise that the programme was merely a modernised adaptation of H.G. Wells' famous novel War of the Worlds, we are repeating the fact which was made clear 4 times on the programme, that while the names of some American cities are used, as in all novels and dramatisations, the entire story and all of its incidents were fictitious. Radio was the quickest way of getting your news back then, so if you wanted to know what was going on, you could switch on your radio and have a pretty good idea of finding out the truth. Local radio hosts themselves repeated this message to their listeners and calmed down any concerned callers. So we can see that, as opposed to masking itself as a hoax, it was very open and honest about what it was. There was a small window in which people could tune in, having missed the beginning, listen for a bit, and then turn off again before hearing the next disclaimer. So with that in mind, let's have a look at all this hysteria stuff. There was undoubtedly some panic. It's just the scale of it which is disputed. Telephone switchboards were overloaded with the volume of calls coming in. Times Square flashed a bulletin saying Orson Welles causes panic. But there were no hospitalizations, no mobs running through the street for their lives. John Houseman, the producer of the play, recalled leaving the studio and being surprised at how life was carrying on in New York as normal. In fact, most people probably weren't listening to the show in the first place. The War of the Worlds was in competition with the Chase and Sanborn Hour, which was by far the more popular programme and had far more listeners. So, what was this panic all about then? Unsurprisingly, our main sources for this are newspapers, and that gives us a bit of a clue. Radio and newspapers were rivals in the information technology world of the 1930s, and here was an opportunity to discredit radio's reliability by printing stories about a radio panic, whilst selling a lot of newspapers in the process. It probably went something like this. Hello, New York Associated Press Office. Hello, I'm at the Washington switchboard. What is going on over there? Oh, there's a panic right now. Hello, it's San Francisco here. Have you heard about that radio play? Oh, there's a panic right now. Calls coming in, flooding the whole switchboard. We only have a couple of hours till press, so I need a story right now. Hello, Chicago here. I need the story right now. So was this all just media hype? In a lot of ways, yes, but I also can see why some people might have taken it seriously. It had only been a month since the signing of the Munich Agreement, and there was a lot of anxiety in the media about Nazi aggression in Europe and what that might mean for the United States. Some listeners actually mistook the aliens for German invaders. So imagine living in 1938, surrounded by radio and newspaper reports of German armies marching across Europe, potentially starting a world war, living in a state of enhanced anxiety, and you switch on your radio one evening to hear that New Jersey is under attack. With this in mind, the whole thing becomes a lot more understandable. People had been emotionally primed for precisely this type of broadcast, and here it was. Maybe that was the entire point. I'm not saying that Wells set out to create a mass panic, but what if he was trying to tell us something about the power of media? That it doesn't really matter if the facts themselves are true or not, but if you say them convincingly enough, then people will believe them. Just 3 years later, he would write and star in one of the greatest films of all time, Citizen Kane, which is all about the power of the media over public opinion. So what if this whole performance was just a meta-commentary on the power of media? What we've done for decades is focus too much on the panic instead of what Wells was trying to tell us. His whole career, in a way, was built on this idea of using media as a commentary on the media itself. His radio debut was in 1935, performing a scene from the play Panic for a CBS News report. It almost feels a little on the nose to suggest that this probably also inspired his version of the War of the Worlds. But by understanding his view of and relationship with the media, we get a better understanding of what this radio play was really all about.